everyone, thank you for joining us today for our 30 on Thursday webinar series where we will be talking about sustainable SharePoint user adoption. If this is your first time joining us, our 30 on Thursday webinar series is a bi-weekly 30-minute SharePoint webinar series where we talk all things Microsoft SharePoint, from how-tos to best practices to products. Our next webinar will be on August 7th, where we will be talking about transforming business processes with digital signatures in SharePoint. You can see the full schedule of our webinars at sharepoint.protiviti.com/webinars. We have a ton of online training coming up, from Nintex to business intelligence. We have 1-hour free webinars and in-depth courses. If you're interested in learning more about our training, you can learn more at sharepoint.protiviti.com/training. Our next SharePoint conference is right around the corner. We will be in Dallas, Texas on October 20th at the Westin Galleria, Dallas. We have separate tracks for business users, technical users, and UX professionals, as well as pre- and post-conference full-day workshops. Everyone on today's call will receive 15% off if you use the promo code at the bottom when registering. You can learn more at sharepointconference.org/Dallas. So for today's session is being recorded. An archive of all of our past sessions can be found at sharepoint.protiviti.com/archived webinars. Today's session will also be found there. For all your questions during today's session, please use the question window in the GoToMeeting toolbar, and we will get to all of them at the end. So for today's session, the topic is sustainable SharePoint user adoption. Today's presenter is Jason Schnur with Protiviti, and I am Julia Oates, and I will be moderating today's session. So let's get started. Jason, I'm going to make you presenter.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Could you just confirm for me that you see the slide there that reads Sustainable SharePoint User Adoption?
Yep, looks good.
Great. Great. Well, thanks very much, Julia, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So just very quickly, introduction of myself. I'm a director with Protiviti in charge of our SharePoint training team. So that includes not only what our curriculum is, but to me, more importantly, how is it that we're helping organizations to be able to achieve sustainable and measurable adoption of SharePoint. That to me is something that has been an elusive goal for many organizations, and we feel we have a prescriptive approach to accomplishing that goal. So just very quick, I'll mention it before we get into the presentation. We are a registered education provider with Project Management Institute. So for example, if you are certified by the Project Management Institute, PMP or otherwise, you will be able to get professional development units for anything that we do, including this webinar, any of our free content, our conferences, any of our paid training. So FYI. So let's get then to user adoption. First, let's just talk about the benefits. Why do we have a goal to achieve user adoption for SharePoint? Well, first of all, let's look at the three main areas here. Within technology, empowered SharePoint users means less SharePoint support, and that's a big, big benefit to technology teams that have a lot of other things to focus on than SharePoint or even just supporting applications within the organization. So then less support means ability to focus on other strategic areas of the business. And from a business perspective, and by business I mean the folks in human resources, I mean the folks in operations, I mean the folks in sales, etc. The benefit of SharePoint is being able to help people collaborate, to team together, to be efficient in the way they're working together at a high level. And then also, assuming that maybe you're using an extranet for your clients, being able to use SharePoint effectively does have an effect on client satisfaction. But even if your clients aren't using the extranet, just having information available in one place that's consistent for staff to be able to utilize is going to have a positive effect on the business and therefore the organizations that you're serving within your business. And then last, from an executive perspective, like anything, the executive team is looking for what is the value of this very significant investment that we've made. So then, what's the reason for this webinar? Why is it that those benefits aren't always realized? Well, practically speaking, the challenges are significant, and mostly it focuses from our perspective and in our experience on the fact that adoption many times falls to the information technology team solely, and it isn't a partnership between across the entire organization. And as this graphic shows, the information technology professionals within the organization have a lot of very important things to focus on. So for example, this graphic says, okay, business intelligence and reporting, all kinds of focus on data, long-term enterprise information strategy. So to me, the summary of the data focus is data management, data security. For obvious reasons, data security is a really big area of focus within information technology. And then business intelligence, how are we getting usable information out of these applications that we're investing in so much? And then down at the bottom, it's encouraging that end user adoption of tools shows up on the first page of priorities, but it's unfortunate at the same time that it is a moderate priority for all of the organizations combined that responded to this Protiviti IT Priorities Survey. By the way, about 1,100 respondents provided information, and about half of those were large companies. So we see that there's a trend. Large companies have an emphasis on user adoption as well as the others, but overall, user adoption is a smaller priority than the data management, than BI, than security. And again, for me, that's for obvious reasons. If you have a breach of your data and the data is not secure, that is going to be a much bigger problem than having adoption challenges within SharePoint. So we understand why the information technology professionals are prioritizing those things over adoption. And then also, in achieving adoption, responsibility needs to lie outside of technology. Certainly, the technology teams are part of helping the rest of the staff to effectively use SharePoint. But really, the business teams need to take primary responsibility for making that happen. So technology, of course, the IT professionals are going to make sure everybody has proper access. Make sure, very likely, that security is tied to Active Directory, for example. Make sure that individuals are encouraged to use SharePoint because maybe we're passing through credentials to the benefits site or to the 401k site or to anything else that's important to individuals. And that's really significant business value that the IT team is providing along with everything else they do within SharePoint. But from the business perspective, really the focus needs to be on how are we helping people to use this easily? How are we personalizing the benefits of SharePoint so that individuals realize those benefits when they visit and are encouraged to do so again? And then also along the same lines, how are we making the solution adoptable? So an example screenshot I have there is an intranet branded Fintranet, and this is for an organization called the Ocean Conservancy, so they branded it Fintranet. And I point that out because of two things. One, they're making the experience engaging, right, by having lots of graphics, by naming it in a way that is attractive to people. It isn't just the boring SharePoint intranet. But also, and probably more importantly, their strategy for creating their intranet and rolling it out was one that was done in phases, in logical phases. They didn't do everything at once. They first rolled out all of the human resources tools and connections, so you can have access to and connectivity to the 401k site, to the benefits site. You can get your expense-related forms. Everything that people kind of need on a daily basis, they brought all that in one place, made it easy to use, and then moved on to other departments. and they've been very successful with a high rate of adoption using Fintranet. And then also the last part here, probably at the beginning of the implementation, or at the beginning of the specific focus on user adoption, is that we need to have executive participation. Executives need to not only define the goals, right? This is overall a change management process. We're asking, for example, people to change from saving documents to a shared drive to saving documents to the SharePoint site so that they're collaborative. And then the executives need to set an example. So, for example, one of our clients, COO, who was the executive sponsor for this implementation, sent out a message once the intranet was launched that he would no longer open attachments that were sent to him via email, that they had to be posted to SharePoint. He had alerts in the libraries that were appropriate for him, and he'd take a look at the document when it was posted. That, again, in our experience, is an unusual approach, but one that's been very, very effective for them, and one that would certainly suggest that you consider. So the combination of all of these things, a lack of clear leadership when it comes to helping the average person to use SharePoint effectively, results in this graphic, and this is from the Association for Image and Information Management, better known as AIM, their market intelligence report. And one of the things that's really striking here is if you combine the two, number 3 and 4 there, the results from resistance from users, that's over 50% of organizations experience resistance from users as one of the biggest ongoing issues with SharePoint. Now, I doubt that's a surprise for anybody on this call, but if we just sit back for a second and think of the amount of actual hard investment dollars, as well as time, as well as effort, as well as the opportunity cost of doing all of these things within SharePoint, as opposed to other priorities, then it's really frustrating that these are the results, right? Lack of expertise in almost 50% of organizations that use SharePoint. I wouldn't have guessed that it would have been that high, and the fact that it is points out that there is certainly focus that needs to be centered on achieving sustainable adoption. I think a couple of significant points is, number one, it's got to be an integral part of the overall strategy in place for SharePoint. So just as an example, what do I mean by that? Many times training, right, affecting user adoption, which isn't just classroom training, but we'll get to that. Many times that's thought of to be done, at the end of the implementation, once it's launched, maybe a couple weeks before launch, and that's generally speaking when business users, those folks who weren't involved in the implementation but will be dependent upon to use it, that's the first time that they get involved, and in our experience that's just too late. And so this effort as well should be planned and budgeted like in implementation. Certainly, you're not going to spend as much on training and affecting adoption as you would on the implementation, but it requires planning. And again, in our experience, and I suspect in yours as well, in big implementations, many times if scope has been added, or if something has taken a little bit longer than originally planned, and budget needs to be cut or time needs to be cut out, well, it's easy to cut off that training line item, because you know what? If you don't have a site that's live, it doesn't really matter if you're going to do any training. Certainly understand that outlook, but what it does is has a really negative long-term effect. So how do we overcome this? Let's get to, how do we combat these results, this lack of expertise, this resistance from users, in a very measured way. So first of all, as I mentioned, getting executives involved and having a specific executive sponsor is a really important part of generating and delivering value and ease of use and awareness within the staff. So as I mentioned the example before, when the executive said I won't open attachments anymore, well, that was at the end of the implementation. At the beginning of the implementation, the executive actually filmed a video that was posted on the intranet that staff could see before it went live. So having staff be encouraged to make use of this tool by someone in a position of authority who's going to set the example is critically important. And I would even go so far as to say is we're not going to accomplish our goals unless that step is taken. So next, now that we have people's attention, we need to understand people's capability to use the tool, right? Do we have 50% of our staff who we would consider to be novice from a SharePoint perspective? Are 50% of them maybe what we would call business users? You know, they understand document management, they understand collaboration, but maybe they aren't to the point of being able to provision a site, etc. So we have to understand our audience before we can effectively communicate with them. Then once we understand them, establishing specific learning objectives for each group of people is really important because that makes it tangible for somebody. So 2 examples, maybe 2 extremes. One, pretty common for everybody in the organization to have the same type of training, or a select group of people to have the same type of training. Maybe it's called power user, and maybe it's called technical, and then great, let's go away. Hey, if people have questions, can you help them out now that you've had this training? That doesn't come anywhere close to what is needed to affect real adoption of SharePoint. Again, many people think of SharePoint as you might think of the Office Productivity Suite, Outlook, etc., because it's a Microsoft tool. Well, in terms of intuitive user adoption, SharePoint can't be compared to the Office suite, and that's for good reason. It isn't just a word processing application like Word. It is a collaborative application. It's an enterprise application. It deserves to have time dedicated for training and for education and for varied education, as we'll see in just a second. So once we've established these learning objectives and we understand who the people are, not only who the people are, what their capabilities are, but what our goals are for people. How much of our staff, what percentage of our staff will really need to be power users? Generally speaking, that's 10 or less. So we're talking to a population of 90% or more of staff that are really just going to be business users. So it's going to be critical that that 90% of staff understands how to use the solution. And then, of course, there are specialty areas that should be paid attention to. We should define who's going to be responsible for that. But to me, the most important group to focus on, assuming that the SharePoint site is stable, we've built it accurately, is that very large population of business users who are going to drive the value we're getting. And so how do we do this? So, of course, most people are familiar with curriculum-based training, right? It's really valuable because you can walk through lab exercises. You can practice what you've seen. In our approach anyway, the instructor is there live with you. And so there's a lot of value in that. But it's not enough. There needs to also be specific SharePoint environment training so that somebody can take knowledge they've learned about overall SharePoint and actually apply that in the way that you've implemented SharePoint. Not all SharePoint, or maybe not even 2 SharePoint implementations, are exactly alike. So we have to give folks the opportunity to experience what's in their particular SharePoint deployment. Then once we've been able to walk through those steps, we can refer back to the results of the capability assessment, the results, the learning objectives that we'd set out, and we can actually present measurable outcomes from this effort in SharePoint, which, from my perspective, again, is rare. And it would be a huge area of value that would allow us to continue to invest in SharePoint and other things as we move forward if we can put together some objective outcomes that can be demonstrated. Then a really good idea here is we're doing all this work should be tracked in the SharePoint intranet so that when folks want to refer to maybe the learning map that they're on, going from a beginner to a business user to a power user, they can see all that within a SharePoint list. It's not contained elsewhere. It's contained within SharePoint. And so also I've talked about traditional training. One of the things that's really important in our experience is to vary training. You know, not all people learn best in a classroom in traditional training. So one example, which I'll show here, is we can provide in-context videos so that folks can understand how to use the solution, and then also go back and refer to them. Because again, these videos, as you might guess, are also tracked within SharePoint. So I'll just play this. It's about a minute long, and I'll be right back with you.
When you and your colleagues get familiar with your SharePoint document library, it will become a hub of activity. If you want to work on a document, check it out. This ensures no one can change it while you're working on it, and that all team members have the latest copy. Check files in and out in 3 easy steps. Watch and see. First, place your pointer over the file name and click the ellipsis, or ... to show the file preview screen. Next, click the second ellipsis. Then click Check Out. Now the file is reserved for only you to work on. You can tell a file is checked out when the file icon shows a green square with a white arrow. Now your second step. Edit and save the file. Click Edit in the document preview. When the file opens, you can work in it and save as many times as you need to. Just remember, when you save, others will not see your changes yet. The third step is to check in the file. Return the file using the same process you used to check out the file. You will see the Check-in option where the Check-out option once was. When you check in the file, others will see your changes, and they will be able to edit the file. It's that easy. Do your victory dance.
So, of course, the humor that's thrown in there at the end is meant to engage the viewer, but of course that's optional. And one of the things that I'll say I want to make sure that I point out is that video was created as an example. I would strongly encourage anybody who is going to take advantage of and create videos to use for training to create those videos using your screenshots, using examples from your intranet. Again, frankly, I don't understand how just a standard plain vanilla video showing plain vanilla SharePoint can be valuable to an average business user when they look at that video and then they come back to their SharePoint deployment and things are just different. Things are in different places. It needs to be customized. If you're going to go to the extent of investing in video, then it should be customized to your environment. It's going to pay back many, many more times than if you just get a standard general SharePoint video. So now that we've done all this work, how do we sustain this adoption? You know, as I've mentioned, this training isn't just one point in time. It's consistent. It's ongoing. Just like taking advantage of the overall investment in SharePoint isn't finished ever. We're finding better ways to use it. We're finding ways to become more efficient. We're finding ways to create more client value. We're finding ways to create more value to the organization for the investment made. So, you know, some examples there, we showed the video, you know, even things like quick reference guides. I point that out here because quick reference guides, you know, printed ones, may seem a little bit old-fashioned, but, you know, keep in mind that every organization, different people learn in different ways. People with different levels of experience in the working world may have preferences about how they learn, so make sure that you vary the delivery methods for this training. And so I thought, before I wrap up here, I thought it would be helpful to not only talk about some of these things, but also show an example of the way you might be able to get started. And this is just a simple Excel document that we put together that shows within generating awareness, the first step, what are all the things we need to accomplish and who's responsible for it. So communicating objectives, it's the executive sponsor. Coordinating the team internally that are going to be leaders, that would maybe lead the train-the-trainer program. The person responsible for that generally is the user adoption lead, for example. So then within the assessment, what are we trying to do there? Determine the specific objectives and who are the people that we're training, right? So from a training perspective, not only providing the training, but also providing a progression plan. You know, think of it as true curriculum. Any type of training that we're doing, obviously universities are a great model, and what we do when we attend university or college is that we are engaged in a progression. We choose a major, we take 101, we go to 201 until we become expert enough to earn that degree. And so there's no difference here. And measurable outcomes, of course, that's meant to objectively track the progress of each user. Sustaining adoption, it's really important, again, get the business teams involved, work with the HR team so that when new hires come in, for example, they have SharePoint training as well, so that you don't have everybody that's new kind of wandering around trying to figure out how to use this tool. And then the last part I'll show you is just an example of that initial capability assessment. Some examples of questions: how often do you collaborate via email? How often do you collaborate via in-person? How often do you use SharePoint? That's great information to get specific to each individual to understand the level of use within the organization. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, I'll display the contact information for me and my colleague John here, and also be happy to take any questions before we wrap up.
Thanks, Jason. If anyone has any questions, please insert them in the question window. Again, the recording of today's webinar will be on our website, sharepoint.protiviti.com/archived-webinars.
So I'm going to take the lack of questions as indication that everybody agrees and completely understands.
Maybe so. We are getting responses to that, Jason. Everyone is saying yes.
Right, perfect.
We'll wait another minute. Okay, we did get one question, Jason. Do you have any ideas on how to get department blogs started? I think it is a great tool, but I'm having trouble getting people to start them.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You know, that's an example of why it's so important to identify advocates early, because the way really to achieve momentum around anything, in this case it's in a blog, right? A blog is meant to provide information that's helpful for people in a place that's easy for them to get to. And really the only way, just like having an effective social media presence, or just like really having anybody take interest in a new initiative, is that those blogs need to be seeded. So somebody actually has to have a responsibility to create them. So for example, internally, we create blog posts, you know, easily more than once a week. We send out information to the marketplace that includes a blog post and some other information. And we actually have a set of folks that are responsible for doing so. And that is led by our project management center of excellence leader, who is responsible for identifying the most compelling topics and then making sure those topics have some thought leadership provided by Protiviti SharePoint solutions. So the short answer to your question is somebody needs to be assigned to do it, and it needs to be consistent, so that individuals understand that they can come to depend on finding information there over time.
Great, and I can also add to that. For our internal blogs, we do use the calendar feature and have deadlines for the blog authors, and they get email notifications for when their blog is due. So that's a way to use the calendar feature as well as deadlines to make sure that you get your regular blog posts. We do have another question. It is, how do you measure ROI from training?
Yeah, that is a great question, and believe me, I've done a lot. I and plenty of other people have done lots of research specific to SharePoint training, and there really aren't any figures available. So that's where this resulted from. So to me, the only way to be able to measure ROI, which of course is going to be different across all organizations, you know, we don't just have a spreadsheet, which I know you're probably not intimating, but we first got to understand and decide, what does value mean to us? So does it mean something, you know, maybe as simple as we're not sharing attachments within email anymore, therefore we have less support requirements and costs, and we have the documents in SharePoint so that people can collaborate on them. That's something that can be measured. Another way to measure the effect of training is to track, there are plenty of tools out there to do this, third-party tools, is to track activity within your SharePoint site, specifically what sites are being hit, how much time is being spent on them. And by the way, this isn't effective if you dictate to everybody that the home page of the intranet, is the browser that's automatically opened. That's not fair, because that's going to give you results that don't indicate actual use. The best way that we've found to do it is to track usage before we assess the capabilities of staff, and then one of the ways to track specifically the ROI is to look at that usage after we've completed and documented our objectives. But that really is what the measurable outcomes phase is focused on, right? The outcomes that are important to your organization are probably going to be a little bit different than outcomes that are important to other organizations, but it's critical to track them. So at the objective stage, we decide what the objectives are. At the outcome stage, we track what we've achieved, and the difference between those two, the result, is the return on investment that you've gotten from the effort.
Great, thank you. So that is it for our questions today, and we are a little over 2 o'clock. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We will see you in 2 weeks, where we will be talking about digital signatures in SharePoint. Have a great day.